Well, good evening and thank you. And thank you to Tamsin and Tom for the opportunity to partake in one of these. Was it 6 years ago? We had something similar along similar lines, which again was a scale project on a 450 square metre site for a suburban home. So Invert, I suppose, revisits this question, and I appreciate David's presentation before in terms of it poses lots of questions, this exhibition, this project, and I really appreciate the variety of other entries that have been presented here. But I just wanted to just give some background. I think what fascinates me about Melbourne and generally this part of the world, and I was especially I found quite informative. It was a wonderful book, 1835 by David Boyce, which talks about settlement and the manner in which settlement has occurred here. And it's interesting, in my view, if we want to project and think about the future, we perhaps need to recognise the journey that we've come to this place now, where we are now, and therefore the questions that poses in the future. So yes, we're talking about a small single dwelling, but we're also talking about bigger picture stuff too. And for me, this is Hoddle's plan that was that set in motion the remarkable development that we see with Melbourne. But of course, essentially, it was a grid established for land speculation, and it was also established so that Tasmanians could come to the mainland here and others to establish a city that very quickly developed. And I think the fascinating thing with Melbourne was one thing that I've learnt in recent times in some of my work, and I'm based in Elwood. I work in the inner city, but also I come regionally. I've lived in the regional cities of Victoria and all three, Bendigo, Ballarat and Geelong. So I've always experienced the city from the outside in, and there's something interesting about that, and also recognising the grid. It was established very quickly, the grid, in the 1850s, I understand, you had to build in brick or stone, and therefore that meant that Chapel Street and Smith Street and all these other streets and inner city areas were quickly established. So single dwelling, worker housing, affordable housing was pushed outside the city. So the city grid has always represented capital and the wealth and establishment of major buildings that just grew and grew vertically. And of course, over the 20th century, we've seen commercial offices, buildings getting bigger and bigger, and the residential population decreasing. So I think it's timely that Melbourne City Council have, and with Rob Adams especially, giving his blessing and opening this exhibition, because it was in the early 1990s that Melbourne City Council was promoting the postcode 3000. I think there was less than 5,000 people living in the CBD. We don't call it the CBD anymore, of course. Hoddle and his grid it's no longer as just a city defined by office buildings. Of course, what have we faced over the last 15, 20 years is, since that time, is the new high-rise is these residential towers. And to me, the central area of Melbourne and the grid, you are not afforded the same restrictions and rights to light and sun that we perhaps ResCode, for all its faults, affords the residential areas and zonings. So yes, David, I agree. I think we've got to re-engage with that question. How do we do it? How do we get here? Regulation has played a part in it, and sometimes it doesn't. And then, of course, we have this nature of this site and how you grapple with it, but equally we can just as easily have a 10-storey building erected right next to you. So all those sort of bespoke and beautiful filigree of trying to relate to where the sun is and relate contextually suddenly goes out the door, and it's already happening. We've seen it with some wonderful, there's been some great commercial buildings that have been built where they've been now completely dwarfed. They rely on sun and light, and you don't get it anymore, so it's gone. And I think that, to me, I found that a deeply challenging aspect of this project, that who wants to live in a 30-metre hole? and next to a car park. I appreciate hopefully these car parks become redundant, and we think of more inventive ways in which we can reuse them and re-inhabit them, and also give back the streets to people to use. So for my project, which I've called the Grid House, but it doesn't inform the planning. It was more thinking about the construction and nature of the construction, how you might do it. Using the 21st century material, which is mass timber and cross-laminated timber construction with an outside grid that can therefore mediate and allow for use of some plants that could grow, although again I challenge or wonder how you can grow something when you're so low and completely shadowed. So therefore the idea of a green roof and building up and living higher becomes more important in the approach that I took. It's essentially a double skin, like others that have approached. In my case, the skin is the actual circulation. So circulation occurs outside the building, and the main functions of the house are contained within. And the main functions are that the ground level is clear, you lift it off the ground, so that may allow for some commercial activity or use, or you just pick the thing up and move it into a sunny spot where you can find it, or it goes and sits on top of another building. The lower levels are devoted to basically, the basic things that you need, washing and cleaning. And then the sleeping zones are split levels that occur above in these areas. And then the living zone and food is devoted to the top level, where you can actually get some sun and light and be up and higher and above to enjoy that sun, hopefully, that you'll still be able to gain. And I was reminded, I think when Tamsin's message came through a couple of months, I had one of those sort of lifetime experiences where I finally went to Kakadu, and I was fascinated by, I guess, the practicality of course, Indigenous inhabitants that live up there. And there was these wonderful rock shelters in Kakadu. And what fascinated me was that there was a particular man who was called the Old Man. He played a key part in establishing the listing of Kakadu as a World Heritage Site. And the interesting thing was he had his rock shelter above the floodplain. He was able to that's where he spent his time. He'd paint on the walls. He even painted the alphabet and other useful information. All the eating and cooking and everything else happened down lower, and one elevated and sat up and enjoyed the air, the cool breezes when they could come, and prospect. And that way there were other benefits. I mean, even the mosquitoes didn't bother you so much when you were up higher and so forth. So for me, it was taking that idea and thinking, yes, the basic necessities and what you need to do are lower down and elevate yourself and get yourself higher up. That's the nature of the city that we have and what we've now adopted. And how the challenge of meeting that with our brief, and how I've taken that approach here with the Grid House. That's adaptable, it's flexible, it accommodates the different nature. I mean, I can appreciate the brief. I've got 2 young children who are growing, and obviously that flexible nature and that arrangement, how that can occur. And so therefore, I think adaptability and flexibility and those sorts of things are important, but also thinking in the bigger picture, okay, especially in the particular nature of this project and this site, how we might think about that in the future. So thank you.